Hey everyone, we are working to hit 1,000 subscribers, and I need your help to get there. If you enjoy the content, please hit that subscribe button right now and like the video.
The first warning sign appeared at the airport, and almost nobody caught it in time. Security personnel at Charles de Gaulle were going about a completely ordinary Tuesday morning when something started feeling wrong. Not dangerous, not threatening, just wrong. The kind of wrong that makes experienced airport staff stop mid-sentence and stare toward the arrivals gate with confusion written all over their faces. Because coming through those automatic doors, one after another, was something France had genuinely never prepared for. Philippine fans, hundreds of them, then more after that. They came carrying handmade banners with messages written in Tagalog and English. They came in matching shirts with a single name stretched across the back. They came waving Philippine flags so large that ordinary travelers had to step aside just to make room in the terminal. And they did not slow down. They kept arriving in waves so relentless and so coordinated that staff from neighboring terminals had to be redirected just to help manage the growing situation inside Terminal 2. Lines that started inside the arrivals hall eventually stretched out through the automatic doors and spilled across the pavement outside the building itself. Witnesses later described the scene as something closer to a championship parade than a travel day. One airport employee reportedly told a journalist that in 15 years of working at Charles de Gaulle, nothing had come close to resembling what unfolded that morning. Not during the FIFA World Cup, not during the Paris Olympics, not for any musician, any athlete, or any political figure passing through those gates in recent memory. And here is the part that made the whole thing almost impossible to fully process. Alexandra Eala had not even landed yet. Somewhere over European airspace, the 20-year-old Filipina tennis sensation was still in transit. The crowd gathering below had not come because she had just won something. They had not flooded Terminal 2 in response to a trophy, a championship, or a historic victory earlier that week. They came purely on belief, on anticipation, on the quiet, unshakable conviction shared by millions of Filipinos across the globe that history was not coming someday. History was coming now, and they were not willing to miss a single second of it. Reportedly, even Rafael Nadal was left speechless watching the momentum surrounding her continue to grow. That detail alone should tell you everything about where Alexandra Eala currently stands in world tennis. It is May 2026, and the numbers surrounding Eala are no longer surprising to anyone paying attention. They are simply extraordinary facts that keep stacking on top of each other. She is officially ranked world number 42. Her career high ranking sits at world number 29, the highest any Filipina has ever reached in the entire history of the WTA. Just 8 days before Paris, she pushed world number 2 Elena Rybakina to her absolute limit at the Italian Open in Rome, producing a performance so competitive that the final scoreline barely captured how closely contested the match truly was. This week, while her fans are already taking over the streets of Paris, Eala herself is still in Strasbourg, still grinding through clay court matches, still searching for every extra minute of preparation before Roland Garros begins. That is worth pausing on for a moment. Her supporters have already booked the hotels, they have already purchased the tickets, they have already packed the flags and printed the banners and mapped out the metro routes from their accommodations to Stade Roland Garros. And while all of that is happening, Alexandra Eala is still on a practice court somewhere, hitting forehands until her arm aches, because that is the only version of herself she has ever known how to be.
But to understand why those scenes unfolded at Charles de Gaulle Airport, and to understand why Paris is bracing for something it has genuinely never experienced before, you cannot start in France. You cannot even start in 2025 or 2026. You have to go back much further than any of that. You have to go back to the Philippines, to the cracked courts, the broken nets, the unfinished fences, and the young girl who looked at all of it and decided none of it would stop her. Quezon City is not where tennis champions are traditionally born. There is no shortage of passion for sport in the Philippines. The country has produced world-class boxers, elite basketball players, and competitive athletes across dozens of disciplines. But tennis, professional tennis at the highest level, has always felt like a sport that happened somewhere else, in Europe, in the United States, in countries where the infrastructure, the funding, and the pathways existed in ways they simply did not in the Philippines. The courts available to young Filipino players were not the pristine, perfectly maintained surfaces that elite juniors in Spain or France or the United States trained on daily. They were public courts, worn surfaces, nets that sagged in the middle, facilities that required imagination and determination to use properly. Alexandra Eala used them anyway. She learned the game on those courts, developing a relationship with tennis that was never about comfort or convenience. It was about obsession. It was about showing up before anyone else arrived and staying after everyone else had left. And by the time she was old enough for the world to start paying attention, something in the way she moved and competed already felt different from the players around her, not just in talent, but in mentality, in the way she processed pressure, in the way she responded when things got difficult. When she was 13 years old, her family made a decision that would change the entire course of Philippine tennis history. They sent her to Spain. Specifically, they sent her to Mallorca, to the Rafa Nadal Academy, the training institution founded by one of the most decorated tennis players the sport has ever produced. And from the outside, it might have sounded like a straightforward move. Talented young player goes to a famous academy to develop her skills. Simple enough. But the Rafa Nadal Academy was never simply about developing tennis skills. Anyone who has spent time understanding what the academy actually represents knows that the building, the courts, and the training philosophy inside are all constructed around a single idea that Rafael Nadal carried throughout his entire legendary career: the idea that suffering is not something champions try to avoid. Suffering is something champions choose deliberately, because greatness cannot be reached any other way. Every brutal drill, every session that continued long after the body wanted to stop, every early morning run across the red clay courts of Mallorca while the rest of the world was still asleep, all of it was designed around that philosophy. Discomfort was not an obstacle at the Rafa Nadal Academy, it was the curriculum. And Alexandra Eala absorbed every single part of it. She did not arrive in Mallorca as a finished product. She arrived as a teenager with raw talent, enormous potential, and zero guarantees about where any of it would lead. What she found there was a system designed to reveal whether that potential could survive real pressure, whether the talent could hold up under genuine hardship, whether the girl from Quezon City who learned tennis on broken public courts had the inner resources to compete with the best young players in the world.
She not only survived it, she thrived inside it. By 2022, after years of the kind of training most teenage players never experience, Alexandra Eala stood on the court at the US Open and did something no Filipina had ever done before her. She won the girls' singles title. She became the first Filipino Grand Slam junior champion the sport had ever seen. And she did it not with the wide-eyed relief of someone who had gotten lucky, but with the composed, almost quiet certainty of someone who had suffered through exactly the kind of preparation required to reach that moment. She left Spain in 2023 carrying far more than a trophy. She carried a discipline and a work ethic that the WTA Tour was about to discover for itself. And the tour would not have to wait long to find out exactly what Alexandra Eala was capable of. March 2025, Miami, the moment everything changed. Eala entered the Miami Open as a wild card. Her ranking at the time sat at 140th in the world, a number that placed her well outside the conversation surrounding genuine title contenders or even deep-run candidates at a WTA 1000 event. The draw was full of established names, top 10 players, and former Grand Slam champions. Nobody in any serious tennis discussion was spending much time talking about the Filipina wildcard in the early rounds. That was about to change in a way nobody had fully anticipated.
Her first notable scalp came against Jelena Ostapenko, a former French Open champion and one of the most dangerous ball strikers in the women's game. Difficult enough on its own. But Eala did not stop there. In the round of 16, she stepped onto the court against Madison Keys, the reigning Australian Open champion, one of the most powerful players on the tour, and someone at the absolute peak of her game entering that tournament. Keys was expected to handle the wild card without serious difficulty. Instead, Eala handled Keys. The win sent a visible tremor through the tournament. People who had not been paying close attention to the wild card from the Philippines started paying very close attention now. And then came the quarterfinals, and the name waiting on the other side of the net was the one name that made the entire tennis world stop and watch. Iga Świątek, world number 1, multiple Grand Slam champion, the player widely considered the most dominant force in women's tennis and one of the most mentally formidable competitors the sport had produced in years. Facing Świątek in a quarterfinal as a wildcard ranked 140th in the world was, by almost every logical measure, an unsurvivable situation for a player of Eala's experience level. Nobody told Alexandra Eala that. She stood on the baseline without a trace of the intimidation that rankings and reputations are supposed to create. She constructed points with patience and aggression in the exact combination the Nadal Academy had spent years drilling into her. She refused to be broken by errors. She refused to surrender momentum when Świątek, as Świątek always does, began pressing harder to force the issue. And when the final point ended, when Świątek's backhand drifted just beyond the baseline and the match was over, Eala's reaction told its own story. She did not collapse to the court. She did not throw her racket into the air or scream at the sky. She stood completely still for a long moment, wide-eyed, quietly absorbing what had just happened, as if she had imagined this exact scene so many times in practice that the reality of it felt less like a shock and more like a confirmation of something she had always believed was possible. It looked less like surprise and more like destiny finally showing up on schedule. Her run ended in the semifinals against Jessica Pegula, but by that point the result almost felt like a secondary detail. The story had already been written. The narrative had already shifted permanently. The Philippines no longer had a promising young prospect somewhere on the horizon. The Philippines had a world-class tennis player capable of defeating the best player on the planet on one of the biggest stages in the sport. And from that afternoon in Miami onward, the Filipino Army began to mobilize behind her in ways that would eventually leave airports, tennis venues, and entire cities completely unprepared for what was coming. What followed over the next several months moved with a speed that caught nearly everyone off guard, including Eala herself.
By June 2025, she had reached her first WTA Tour final in Eastbourne, a result that confirmed Miami was not a one-tournament eruption of form, but the beginning of a sustained climb toward the sport's upper tier. By August, she captured her first WTA 125 title in Guadalajara, Mexico, winning the tournament with the kind of composed, professional tennis that separated genuine champions from players who simply have great weeks occasionally. The title removed any remaining doubt from the conversation. Alexandra Eala was not a wildcard story. She was not a feel-good narrative about an underdog getting lucky in the right draw at the right moment. She was a legitimate, developing force in women's tennis, and the rankings were beginning to reflect exactly that. Then August turned into late summer, and New York arrived. The U.S. Open 2025 produced a moment that millions of Filipinos watching across different countries and different time zones will likely never forget. Eala stepped onto the court at Flushing Meadows and did something that had never been done before in the open era of tennis. She became the first Filipino player to win a Grand Slam singles main draw match.
defeating world number 14 Clara Towson in a performance that transformed the atmosphere inside the stadium into something that felt fundamentally different from a typical first-round match. Filipino supporters had packed entire sections of the stands. Flags appeared everywhere. The chanting was relentless, emotional, and completely overwhelming in its volume and sustained energy. Members of Towson's team later admitted they had specifically prepared for the crowd atmosphere before the match began, understanding that walking into a court where Alexandra Eala was playing had become a genuinely different experience from walking into any other match on the draw. Eala eventually lost in the second round to the tournament's eventual finalist, but in the context of what that victory represented for Philippine tennis, for the Filipino diaspora spread across every corner of the globe, and for every young Filipino kid who had ever picked up a tennis racket and wondered whether someone who looked like them could ever compete at the sport's highest level, the result almost felt irrelevant. What mattered was that it had happened. What mattered was that the barrier had been broken, and nothing about the sport would ever look quite the same again from inside the Philippines. The country had been waiting for this for a very long time. And then came November 19th, 2025, a date that deserves its own chapter entirely. Exactly 1 year after Rafael Nadal stepped off a tennis court for the final time, bringing an end to one of the most celebrated careers in the history of sport, the 22-time Grand Slam champion returned to a court for the first time since retirement. He could have practiced with anyone: former colleagues, current top 10 players, promising young prospects from Spain's incredibly deep talent pool. The entire tennis world was available to him. He chose Alexandra Eala. For 45 minutes at the Rafa Nadal Academy in Mallorca, the two left-handers trained side by side on the clay courts where Eala had spent her formative years learning the game. They exchanged heavy baseline rallies. They sprinted through exhausting drills. They brought the full intensity of the Academy's philosophy to a session that felt, from the footage shared afterward, like something closer to two competing professionals than a retired legend casually hitting with a young student. Nadal posted the footage publicly. He wrote that being back on court felt incredible, that it was wonderful practicing with Eala, and then added, in the kind of casual, offhand comment that somehow carried an enormous amount of weight, that next time he would need to come back stronger. The tennis world went quiet reading those words.
One of the greatest players in the history of the sport, a man with 22 Grand Slam titles, suggesting in a public post that he needed to raise his level to keep up with a 20-year-old from Quezon City. Analysts processed it, former players processed it, fans across every tennis community online processed it and came to roughly the same conclusion. The respect Nadal was showing her felt completely genuine. Not promotional, not performative, not the polished language of someone saying the right things for the cameras. It felt like one competitor genuinely acknowledging another competitor's quality in the most honest way possible. But the part of the story that most headlines failed to mention came months later. During an interview with Andy Roddick, Eala was asked what it was actually like being around Rafael Nadal, not in a general sense, but genuinely. The man whose academy shaped her game, the man whose philosophy she carries into every match she plays, the man who, in some very real and meaningful way, is responsible for a significant portion of who she has become as a tennis player and as a competitor. Her answer came without hesitation. She admitted that whenever she is around Rafael Nadal, she still goes completely speechless. She said it never becomes normal, standing beside someone who achieved everything he achieved in tennis. It does not matter how many times they have practiced together or spoken at the academy. It does not matter how comfortable the environment feels or how much time has passed since she first arrived in Mallorca as a 13-year-old with big dreams and no guarantees. Being near him still leaves her searching for words every single time. Sit with that for a moment. the young player that Rafael Nadal was reportedly left speechless watching, and the same young player still left completely speechless standing beside him. Two left-handers on a clay court in Mallorca, connected by a philosophy that neither of them has ever needed to explain out loud, because both of them live it every single day. It became one of those rare tennis moments that felt genuinely bigger than rankings or trophies or tournament results, the kind of image the sport carries with it for years because it captures something true about why people fall in love with competition in the first place. 2026 arrived, and the Filipino Army surrounding Eala grew to levels that nobody had seriously predicted. The season opened in Auckland, where Eala pushed into the semi-finals, and in doing so, officially broke into the WTA Top 50 for the first time in her career. Another historic milestone, another boundary crossed, another moment where the Philippines could look at a leaderboard in professional women's tennis and see their player's name in a position it had never occupied before. The momentum entering the Australian Open felt different from anything the tour had experienced around a young player in quite some time. Different was not a strong enough word for what actually happened in Melbourne. Eala was drawn to play her opening match against Alicia Parks on Court 6, one of the smaller outside courts at Melbourne Park. Tournament organizers had scheduled the match expecting a typical early round atmosphere, maybe some enthusiastic supporters, a decent crowd for a young player with growing popularity, standard Australian Open first round energy. What they got was something else entirely. Filipino fans began arriving before the venue gates had even opened for the day. By the time the match was approaching, the lines outside Court 6 had grown so enormous that they were reportedly causing traffic congestion around parts of the tennis complex itself. International media outlets that had arrived to cover the Australian Open's bigger headline matches suddenly found themselves redirecting cameras and journalists toward Court 6 to cover something nobody had planned on covering. Even Amana Anisimova, one of the tour's established names, later admitted she stayed to watch because the atmosphere felt unlike anything she had experienced at a tennis tournament in her career. Eala lost the match, and the crowd reacted as if they had watched her win a Grand Slam title. The standing ovation after the final point lasted longer than many championship celebrations seen at that same tournament. It was not the reaction of disappointed fans absorbing a defeat. It was the reaction of millions of people, represented in that crowd by hundreds of passionate supporters who understood that the result of a single first-round match was almost irrelevant compared to the larger story moving forward in front of them. They were not cheering for a scoreline. They were cheering for a movement.
As the tour moved through the Middle East, Abu Dhabi, Doha, and Dubai, the pattern surrounding Eala repeated itself at every stop with increasing intensity. Fans arrived hours before matches. Queues formed outside gates before venues had opened. Workers in Abu Dhabi reportedly abandoned entire shifts to find screens and catch her matches live. The atmosphere inside stadiums during her matches was consistently described by multiple players as feeling far closer to a football environment than anything they associated with traditional tennis crowds. The noise was relentless. The emotional investment from the stands was impossible to ignore, regardless of which end of the court you were standing on. In Dubai, Eala produced what many analysts considered one of the most significant wins of her young career when she defeated world number 8 Jasmine Paolini 6-1, 7-6 in front of a crowd that erupted after almost every single point. Officials at the Dubai Tennis Championships reportedly acknowledged afterward that they had never experienced anything comparable in the tournament's more than 30 years of history. 30 years of professional tennis at one of the sport's most established stops on the calendar, and nothing had prepared them for what Alexandra Eala and her supporters brought to the venue. Coco Gauff, who faced Eala in the quarterfinals, was asked directly before the match how she intended to handle the atmosphere. Gauff answered with an honesty that was notable in itself. She explained that while she had dealt with hostile or intensely partisan crowds before, in places like Rome and Paris, where the home crowd could be fiercely vocal, the energy surrounding Eala felt different enough that she had approached her mental preparation for the match differently from how she would normally prepare. She acknowledged that this level of passionate, coordinated global support was ultimately a genuinely positive thing for tennis as a sport, even when it created an uncomfortable and intimidating environment for opponents. That is a remarkable thing for a top-5 player to say publicly about a competitor still working her way into the top 30. Then came the clay. The European clay court season, arriving each spring, represents one of the most demanding tests any tennis player faces, and for Alexandra Eala entering 2026, it carried a particular kind of challenge. Her game had always looked most comfortable on hard courts. The heavy left-handed serve, built on the aggressive mechanics she developed under years of Nadal Academy training. The explosive topspin ground strokes from the baseline. The aggressive positioning that rewarded early ball striking and punished passive defending. On hard courts, with their faster pace and higher bounce, these weapons fired at maximum effectiveness. Clay changes every single calculation. It slows points down fundamentally. It rewards patience over aggression in almost every exchange. It forces players to construct rallies with a discipline and a sustained physical effort that hardcourt tennis simply does not demand in the same way. Players who arrive on clay without the right movement patterns, without the right tactical patience, and without the right mental tolerance for longer, more grinding points get exposed quickly. And by nearly every surface analysis available, clay should have been the surface that gave Eala the most difficulty in her development as a professional player. The early results in 2026 reflected exactly that. She fell to Jelena Ostapenko in Linz. She exited early in Stuttgart. She lost in Madrid. The clay was doing what clay does to players who have not yet fully cracked its particular code, asking questions that her game, brilliant as it was on hard courts, did not yet have complete answers for. There were stretches in those early clay matches where the patience required for the surface seemed to conflict with the aggressive instincts that had carried her to so many hard-court victories. But something started changing in Rome.
Movement that had looked slightly uncomfortable on clay began smoothing out. The tactical patience that clay demands began appearing in her point construction more consistently. The confidence that had always been present in her game started rebuilding itself on this different surface in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. In the opening round of the Italian Open, she defeated Magdalena French with the kind of composed, structured tennis that clay rewards. Then she stepped out against Wang Xinyu, the same player who had beaten her in Auckland months earlier, and this time the outcome was completely different. 6-4, 6-3, playing with authority on a surface that had been humbling her for weeks. From there, Eala advanced to the third round of the Italian Open for the first time in her career before losing to world number 2 Elena Rybakina in a match that multiple observers described as far more competitive than the scoreline ultimately reflected. Afterward, speaking with Tennis Channel, Eala explained that she was finally beginning to find genuine footing on clay courts. She said she felt physically stronger, mentally sharper, and more complete as a player than she had been at any earlier point in her career. The demanding off-season work she and her coaching team had committed to was starting to show itself on court in exactly the ways they had hoped. Roland Garros was 1 week away, and for the first time, the idea of Alexandra Eala genuinely threatening the competition at the French Open did not feel like optimism. It felt like a reasonable assessment of where her game currently stood. Here is something that tells you everything you need to know about the player Alexandra Eala has become. When Strasbourg Draw was initially released, Eala found herself placed in the qualifying rounds, despite already being ranked inside the world's top 40. Most players at her ranking position, 1 week before a Grand Slam, would have taken the rest, would have protected the body, preserved the energy, banked the recovery time before the biggest clay tournament in the world.
That is the rational, professional, strategically sound decision that the vast majority of players in her position would have made without much deliberation. Eala entered qualifying anyway. That decision is not a trivial detail. It is a direct and visible expression of everything the Rafa Nadal Academy installed in her during the years she spent training on those Mallorca clay courts. The philosophy built by Nadal himself did not teach students to manage their way to success. It taught them to outwork every opponent, to embrace discomfort as an advantage rather than a warning sign, and to treat every available minute of preparation as exactly that, an opportunity that only the committed choose to take. When Hailey Baptiste withdrew from the main draw and Eala was moved in directly, a fascinating path suddenly opened in front of her. Potential matchups in the early rounds against Emma Raducanu, Katerina Siniakova, and Marie Bouzkova represented beatable opponents for a player at Ayala's current level. The draw beyond those rounds would bring the names that define the current era of women's tennis: Aryna Sabalenka, defending champion Coco Gauff, Iga Świątek, Elena Rybakina, players who have shared Grand Slam titles among themselves for the better part of the last 4 years. Last year, when Eala made her Roland Garros debut, she arrived as a historic first, the first Filipina woman in the Open era to compete in a Grand Slam main draw. She lost in the opening round to Emiliana Arango, and even then, something felt different about the energy surrounding her at the tournament. The crowd, though smaller than what would come later, already felt invested in a way that went beyond typical first-round interest. This year, she arrives as something entirely different.
She arrives as a top 40 player with a Grand Slam main draw victory on her record. She arrives with a WTA title, a career-high ranking of world number 29, and a global fan base of millions that has turned every tournament she enters into an event unlike anything organizers or opponents have experienced before. She arrives with clay court form that has been improving week by week at exactly the right moment. And she arrives with an entire nation watching from thousands of miles away, willing to book flights, abandon sleep schedules, and rearrange entire lives just to be present for whatever comes next. Roland Garros has hosted some of the most powerful fan followings in tennis history. It witnessed waves of American flags filling Court Philippe Chatrier during the peak years of Serena Williams, whose presence at the French Open carried a weight and a cultural significance that transcended the sport itself. It watched entire sections of the main show court dressed in Swiss red and white during the Federer years, a global following that turned every match he played at any Grand Slam into something approaching a pilgrimage for his most devoted supporters. It hosted the Nadal era across 2 decades, when the red clay of Roland Garros became so synonymous with a single player that the tournament and the man seemed impossible to separate from each other. But Roland Garros has never experienced a Filipino diaspora movement. It has never had to prepare for the organizational reality of a passionate, coordinated, financially committed overseas community of millions mobilizing around a single player with the kind of unified intensity that Eala's supporters have demonstrated at every tournament stop this season. Melbourne witnessed it. Abu Dhabi witnessed it. Rome witnessed it. Dubai witnessed it. Each time, the scale was larger than the time before. Each time, the venues were less prepared than they thought they had been. Each time, the players who faced her found themselves accounting for a crowd variable that simply does not exist in the same form for any other competitor currently on the tour. Paris is next, and Paris is bigger than any of those stops. Tournament organizers at Roland Garros already know what is coming. The hotel booking data from Paris in the weeks surrounding the French Open already reflects the Filipino diaspora's presence in numbers that would not exist if Eala were not in the draw. Ticket sales for courts where she is scheduled to practice have followed patterns that no practice session at a Grand Slam has any business following. The Philippine flag has been spotted at street markets near the tournament grounds, being purchased in quantities that make the souvenir vendors smile in slightly confused delight.
The Filipino Army has arrived, and the tournament has not even started. What makes all of this remarkable, beyond the tennis results and beyond the crowd sizes and beyond the airport chaos and the traffic jams and the workers abandoning shifts, is what it represents at a deeper level. Alexandra Eala grew up on public courts in Quezon City with worn surfaces and sagging nets. She learned discipline in conditions that would have discouraged most players before they ever developed far enough to discover whether they had genuine talent. She crossed the world at 13 years old to train in a foreign country under a philosophy that treated discomfort as the foundation of everything worth building. She did all of that without a roadmap, without a template from her own country to follow, without a single Filipino player who had walked this specific path before her and could tell her exactly what to expect when she got there. She built the path herself, and now millions of people are walking it behind her. The Filipino diaspora is one of the largest in the world, spread across every continent, present in nearly every major city, carrying a national identity with them through decades of distance from home. Sport has always offered that community something powerful, a shared focal point, a reason to gather, a figure whose victories feel collective rather than individual because the story behind them resonates so personally across so many different lives and experiences. Manny Pacquiao gave Filipino communities around the world that feeling for years. The national basketball team has provided it in different ways at different moments. But tennis, professional women's tennis at the Grand Slam level, has never provided it before. Not like this. Not with a player ranked inside the world's top 40, arriving at the French Open with genuine momentum, improving clay court form, and the kind of mental foundation that comes from training under the most decorated clay court player in the sport's history. What happens at Roland Garros 2026 cannot be predicted with certainty. Tennis does not work that way. Draws are brutal, opponents are extraordinary, and the clay of Paris has humbled players far more experienced and far more decorated than a 20-year-old still in the early chapters of what looks like a remarkable career. But something has already happened that no result in the draw can take back. A girl from Quezon City who learned tennis on broken courts, who crossed the world alone at 13 to prove something to herself before anyone else was paying attention, who absorbed a philosophy built entirely around choosing suffering over comfort because greatness demanded nothing less. That girl is now standing at the entrance of the most historic clay court tournament in the world, ranked among the sport's top 40 players, with an entire nation and a global diaspora of millions standing behind her so completely, so passionately, and so visibly that the airports of Paris had to call in extra staff before she had even landed. Think about what that means, not just for Philippine tennis, not just for Southeast Asian tennis, but for every young athlete anywhere in the world, growing up on imperfect courts in overlooked places, watching a sport that has never fully looked like them, wondering whether the gap between where they are and where the best players in the world compete is a distance that can actually be crossed. Alexandra Eala is crossing it in real time in front of millions of people watching from every time zone on the planet. And Roland Garros 2026 is about to find out exactly how far she can go. The Filipino Army is already there. They got there before she did, and they are not leaving until the last ball has been struck and the last point has been played. Whatever comes next, Paris was never going to be ready for this.